March 1943, 26,000 feet above northern Germany. The sky is not blue anymore. It is thin, pale, almost colorless. Engines strain against air that barely exists. Inside the cockpit, metal surfaces burn with cold. Oxygen masks frost over with every breath. Hands stiffen, fingers lose feeling, and instruments respond seconds slower than they should. American pilots keep climbing. Below them, the bomber formations hold steady, exposed and vulnerable. Flak bursts bloom in black clouds, precise and methodical. German fighters wait higher still, where survival itself is uncertain. At these altitudes, a mistake is not forgiven. Oxygen failure means unconsciousness in seconds. Cold seeps true flight suits into muscle and bone. German Air Command believed these heights would limit the enemy. Human bodies were not meant to function here for long. Aircraft could reach it, but pilots could not endure it. Yet American fighters continue to appear. Mission after mission, German controllers notice the same unsettling pattern. Escorts remain with the bombers longer than expected. Fighters stay higher, colder, longer than doctrine predicts. Losses mount, but the Americans do not stop flying. What German command is witnessing is not recklessness. It is persistence pushed beyond safe margins. To understand why this shook the Luftwaffe so deeply, it is necessary to step back, before the frostbite, before the oxygen failures, to the assumptions that defined how air war was supposed to be fought. When the air war over Europe began to intensify, altitude was not merely a tactical choice. It was a boundary, one defined by engineering limits, human physiology, and doctrine developed long before combat conditions tested those assumptions. By 1942, the United States Army Air Forces committed to a strategy that placed American crews in some of the most hostile environments any human had willingly entered. The daylight precision bombing campaign of the 8th Air Force required heavy bombers to fly high, often above 25,000 feet, to reduce vulnerability to ground fire and improve bombing accuracy. On paper, the logic was sound. In reality, it placed airmen into a zone where survival itself was uncertain. At these altitudes, temperatures routinely dropped below -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Oxygen levels were so low that unprotected consciousness could fade in seconds. Aircraft cabins were unpressurized. Every crew member relied on oxygen systems that were fragile, imperfect, and prone to failure. A cracked hose, a frozen valve, or a loose connection could be fatal long before enemy fire entered the equation. American planners understood these risks. They accepted them anyway. German air doctrine had reached different conclusions. The Luftwaffe emphasized interception efficiency and pilot endurance within known physiological limits. German fighters were optimized to climb quickly, attack aggressively, and return to base. Prolonged exposure at extreme altitude was considered unsustainable. Pilots were trained to exploit altitude tactically, not to live there. This difference mattered. Early in the campaign, German commanders believed altitude would impose a natural ceiling on American operations. Bombers could reach high altitudes, but escorts could not remain with them indefinitely. Fighters, it was assumed, would be forced to descend or disengage due to cold, oxygen strain, and fuel limitations. For a time, this seemed to work. American losses were severe. Bomber crews suffered casualties not only from enemy action, but from exposure. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Hypoxia caused confusion, delayed reactions, and blackouts. Some aircraft returned with crew members frozen in their positions. Oxygen masks ice solid. Yet despite these conditions, American missions continued. Commanders did not scale back altitude. They did not shorten escort duration. Instead, they adapted. Equipment was modified. Oxygen systems improved incrementally. Heated flight gear was refined. Training emphasized recognition of hypoxia symptoms and emergency procedures under extreme cold. None of this eliminated the danger. It merely made it survivable long enough to complete the mission. German Air Command began noticing something unexpected. Escorts were staying longer. Fighters were climbing higher. Interceptions that once relied on bomber isolation were becoming contested engagements. The environment that was supposed to enforce limits was being challenged. And as American pilots continued flying where survival was never guaranteed, the Luftwaffe faced an opponent willing to accept conditions German doctrine had ruled out entirely, an acceptance that would soon force a fundamental reassessment of how air war could be won. By late 1942 and early 1943, the air war over Europe was no longer defined solely by aircraft performance. It was defined by endurance, how long pilots could remain functional in conditions that steadily eroded human capacity. American fighter escorts initially struggled to match the demands placed upon them. Early escort aircraft lacked the range to remain with bombers deep into Germany. Pilots flew at the edge of their endurance, managing fuel, oxygen, and freezing temperatures simultaneously. Missions stretched for hours. Mistakes accumulated quietly inside cockpits where numb fingers fumbled switches, and frost crept across gauges. German Air Command interpreted these difficulties as confirmation of their assumptions. They believed the Americans were operating beyond what could be sustained. Losses would force retreat. Exposure would impose its own attrition. Instead, American persistence increased. The introduction of improved escort tactics in aircraft extended American reach. Pilots adjusted climb profiles to conserve oxygen. Formations rotated positions to reduce cold exposure. Crews learned to function despite partial numbness, despite impaired vision, despite the constant threat of hypoxia. Physiological limits were not removed. They were negotiated with. German intelligence reports began reflecting concern rather than confidence.
Escorts were present at altitudes once considered impractical. American fighters engaged above bomber formations, not merely alongside them. Interceptions that relied on altitude advantage were increasingly contested. The cold itself became a battleground. German pilots operating under similar environmental conditions were not immune to the same risks, but their doctrine discouraged prolonged exposure. Engagements were designed to be brief. American persistence disrupted this rhythm. Freighters stayed. Pressure continued. The expected windows of vulnerability narrowed. What unsettled German command was not simply American bravery. It was American willingness to treat human endurance as a variable rather than a limit. The Luftwaffe faced increasing strain. Aircraft maintenance suffered under constant operations. Pilot fatigue mounted. Interception success rates declined as American escorts closed gaps once taken for granted. Altitude had been expected to impose a natural order on the air war. Instead, it became a domain where Americans demonstrated a capacity to endure conditions others avoided. By the spring of 1943, German air planners were forced to reconsider fundamental assumptions. If Americans could operate effectively at the edge of human survival, then no altitude offered safety. No environmental barrier guaranteed advantage. The air war was shifting from a contest of tactics to a test of who could remain functional longest in an environment that punished everyone equally. And as both sides pushed higher, colder, and farther, the stage was set for a turning point where persistence itself would become a strategic weapon. At extreme altitude, the aircraft was no longer the limiting factor. The human body was. American pilots flew in unpressurized cockpits where temperatures could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Oxygen depredation blurred vision, slowed reflexes, and impaired judgment. Hypoxia did not announce itself loudly. It crept in quietly, turning routine tasks into fatal errors. German Air Command understood these dangers well. Luftwaffe medical officers had long warned them how long exposure above certain altitudes degraded combat effectiveness. Doctrine reflected this. German fighters were expected to strike quickly, then descend. American pilots violated this expectation repeatedly. They remained at altitude long after discomfort turned into danger. They escorted bombers not because conditions allowed it, but because mission success demanded it. Survival became secondary to presence. Angle 2. Technology pushed to human limits. American aircraft were not designed to make high-altitude flight comfortable. They were adapted to make it barely possible. Oxygen systems froze, masks cracked, regulators failed under vibration and cold. Pilots learned to recognize the subtle signs of system malfunction, slight dizziness, tingling fingers, narrowing vision, and respond instantly. German observers noted this adaptation with concern. American aircraft continued operating despite visible signs of strain. Escorts did not withdraw when equipment faltered. They compensated. The technology did not remove risk. It redistributed it. Angle flee. German doctrine under pressure. German interception strategy relied on predictable patterns. Bombers flew high. Escorts dropped away. Attacks exploited isolation. When American fighters remained, these patterns collapsed. German pilots were forced into prolonged engagements at altitude, where cold and oxygen strain affected them as well. The expected advantage of brief decisive attacks eroded. Interceptions became contests of endurance rather than timing. This shift strained German resources and morale. Altitude had been considered a natural flosure. Instead, it became a shared burden. And as American persistence forced German pilots to fight where survival itself was uncertain, the air war entered a phase where endurance, not superiority, began deciding outcomes. To German Air Command, the most destabilizing effect of American high-altitude persistence was psychological. The presence of escorts where none were expected altered decision-making in the air and on the ground. German pilots climbed to intercept believing they would encounter bombers alone. Instead, they found fighters already waiting, at altitude, in position, and prepared. The shock was not dramatic, but cumulative. Each failed interception reinforced the same message. The Americans were willing to stay where doctrine said no one should. This eroded confidence. Engagements became cautious. Timing slipped. Pilots hesitated.
Longer before committing to attacks that once seemed routine. Angle 5. Training, replacement, and acceptance of loss. American air strategy accepted loss as part of the system. Pilots were trained with the expectation that exposure injuries, equipment failures, and combat casualties would occur. Replacement pipelines existed to absorb them. German Air Command could not replace experienced pilots at the same rate. Every loss mattered more. Prolonged exposure multiplied fatigue and attrition. What Americans treated as cost, Germans experienced as depletion. Altitude magnified this imbalance. Angle 6. When environment became the enemy. Above 25,000 feet, the enemy was not always visible. Cold froze weapons. Oxygen failures incapacitated pilots without warning. Aircraft iced over mid-mission. American pilots continued anyway. This willingness to treat environment as an adversary equal to the Luftwaffe altered the nature of the campaign. The air war became less about exploiting advantage and more about surviving conditions long enough to deny the enemy theirs. By the time German Air Command fully recognized this shift, it was already shaping operational outcomes. The contest was no longer about who could climb higher, but about who could remain functional longer in a place where survival was never assured. The turning point arrived not with a single battle, but with a pattern that could no longer be ignored. By the summer of 1943, German Air Command reviewed interception reports that shared the same troubling detail. American escorts were present earlier. They remained longer. They fought higher. The assumptions that had shaped Luftwaffe planning since the beginning of the air war were collapsing under accumulated evidence. The introduction of long-range escorts transformed the equation. Fighters no longer appeared briefly at the edges of bomber streams. They stayed with them, deep into German airspace, at altitudes where the margin between function and failure was razor-thin. For German commanders, this was not merely a tactical development, it was a physiological one.
Fighter engagements now occurred where pilots operated under continuous oxygen strain, extreme cold, and mounting fatigue. Missions stretched longer. Recovery took more time. The expected rhythm of interception, climb, strike, disengage, was disrupted. American pilots accepted this disruption. They adapted to it. German pilots were forced to do the same, but without the same margin for loss. Each prolonged engagement at altitude increased exposure injuries, fatigue-related errors, and equipment failures. The environment, once considered an ally, now punished both sides equally. German Air Command responded with urgency. Interception tactics were adjusted. Altitude advantages were contested more aggressively. Pilots were ordered to engage escorts directly rather than focus solely on bombers. This adaptation carried cost. Engagements became more dangerous. Loss rates rose. Fatigue accumulated faster than replacements could compensate. The Luftwaffe was being drawn into sustained combat in conditions it had deliberately sought to avoid. The decisive realization was this: American pilots were not avoiding the edge of survivability, they were operating within it by design. German command had believed altitude would enforce limits. Instead, it had become a shared battlefield, one where persistence mattered more than perfection. And as American fighters continued to fly where survival was never guaranteed, German air planners faced a future in which no altitude, no cold, and no physiological boundary could be relied upon to slow the enemy. The consequences of that realization unfolded rapidly through the second half of 1943. As American escort coverage expanded, German Air Command saw interception effectiveness decline across entire regions. Bomber formations that once fractured under attack now held together. Losses continued, but missions were completed with increasing regularity. Targets deep inside Germany were struck repeatedly, not because defenses had failed, but because escorts had removed the Luftwaffe's decisive window. For German planners, this was a strategic shock. Altitude had been expected to enforce separation. Bombers above, escorts below, fighters diving through briefly. Instead, American pilots occupied the same thin airspace as German interceptors, forcing prolonged engagements where neither side could disengage easily without abandoning advantage. At these heights, pilots were no longer fighting only each other. They were fighting time. Oxygen regulators struggled to keep pace with exertion. Cold stiffened control surfaces. Vision narrowed. Judgment slowed. Each minute spent at altitude increased the chance of error. American pilots accepted this cost. German pilots were compelled to match it. Luftwaffe medical reports reflected growing concern. Fatigue was accumulating faster than it could be managed. Recovery periods lengthened. Exposure injuries increased. Combat readiness declined incrementally but persistently. German Air Command attempted to compensate. New tactics emphasized head-on attacks to shorten exposure. Increased flat coverage was ordered to reduce reliance on fighter interception. Experimental aircraft designs pushed climb performance even further. None of it restored the earlier balance. American persistence neutralized altitude as a limiting factor. Escorts didn't need to win every engagement. They only needed to remain present. Their continued presence forced German pilots to operate under sustained physiological strain, eroding effectiveness over time. By late 1943, German planners faced an uncomfortable truth. The air war was no longer being decided by who could climb higher altitudes or fly faster aircraft. It was being decided by who could endure hostile conditions longer without collapse. American pilots had transformed survival itself into a weapon. This shift didn't end the air war overnight, but it changed its direction permanently. From this point forward, German air defenses would operate under constant pressure, unable to rely on environment or doctrine to restore advantage. And as the effects of this endurance-based strategy spread, the Luftwaffe would enter a phase where every mission cost more than it could afford, marking the beginning of a decline shaped not by a single defeat, but by sustained exposure to a war fought at the edge of human survival. By early 1944, the consequences of sustained high-altitude combat were unmistakable within the German air defense system. The Luftwaffe was still flying, still intercepting, still fighting, but it was no longer recovering. Losses that had once been absorbed were now permanent. Experienced pilots were increasingly rare. Training programs shortened, producing replacements with fewer flight hours and limited exposure to extreme altitude conditions. Fatigue became cumulative. Each mission carried forward the strain of the last. American operations, by contrast, showed continuity. Bomber formations continued to penetrate deep into German airspace. Escorts remained present throughout missions that stretched for hours at altitude. The cold, the hypoxia, the mechanical failures all remained. What changed was how effectively they were managed. German Air Command recognized that altitude had failed as a limiting factor. Instead of reducing American effectiveness, it had exposed a disparity in endurance systems. American losses were replenished. German losses eroded capability. This imbalance reshaped German strategy. Greater emphasis was placed on ground-based defenses. Anti-aircraft artillery expanded rapidly, forming dense flat corridors intended to compensate for declining fighter effectiveness. Interception tactics were simplified, favoring brief, high-risk engagements over sustained combat. These measures slowed American advances but did not reverse them. Psychologically, the shift was profound. German pilots now entered combat knowing escorts would be present. The expectation of isolation, once a cornerstone of interception planning, had vanished. Engagements began earlier and lasted longer. The margin for error shrank. The environment that once promised advantage now imposed cost. American pilots continued flying where survival was uncertain, not because conditions improved, but because endurance had been institutionalized. Cold injuries were treated as routine. Oxygen system failures were anticipated. Procedures emphasized continuation rather than withdrawal. German Air Command could see the outcome forming. It was not dramatic. It was incremental. Each mission left the Luftwaffe slightly weaker than before. And as this cumulative decline continued, it became clear that the struggle for air superiority was no longer about tactics alone, but about whether an air force could sustain operations indefinitely in conditions that punished every weakness.
As 1944 progressed, the cumulative strain on the Luftwaffe became impossible to conceal. Aircraft still rose to meet incoming formations, but the force that once met the Americans with confidence now did so out of necessity. Missions were flown because they had to be flown, not because success was expected. Pilot turnover accelerated. Veterans who had survived years of combat were gone, lost to combat, exposure, or exhaustion. Their replacements lacked not only experience, but the physiological conditioning that extreme altitude combat demanded. High-altitude flight was no longer merely dangerous, it was debilitating. German Air Command issued increasingly urgent directives. Fighters were to engage only when success was probable. Fuel was conserved. Aircraft were dispersed. Yet none of these measures addressed the core problem. The environment itself had become an adversary the Luftwaffe could no longer afford to fight within. American operations pressed on without pause. Escort planes now accompanied bombers from takeoff to target and back again. The cold remained brutal. Oxygen systems still failed. Pilots still suffered frostbite, hypoxia, and fatigue. What differed was scale. American training and replacement systems absorbed these losses. The presence of escorts became predictable, so predictable that their absence would have been more surprising. German planners understood what this meant. Airspace was no longer contested selectively. It was contested continuously. Every mission demanded response. Every response extracted cost. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to contest American bombing had degraded sharply. Interceptions were fewer, engagement shorter, effectiveness declined even when contact was made. American bombers reached targets with increasing regularity, not because defenses had disappeared, but because they could no longer operate at the level required. The endurance-based strategy had worked. Altitude, once viewed as a natural boundary, had been neutralized. Cold and oxygen deprivation no longer deterred American presence. Instead, they imposed asymmetrical strain, one side capable of absorbing it, the other slowly consumed by it. German Air Command faced an outcome shaped not by a single failure, but by relentless exposure to conditions that irradiated capability mission by mission. The air war over Europe was effectively decided not by who flew higher or faster, but by who could remain functional longer where survival was never assured. And as the Luftwaffe's resistance waned, the meaning of the shift extended beyond the skies, shaping the final phase of the war itself. The shock that unsettled German Air Command was not caused by a single aircraft, a single tactic, or a single battle. It emerged from repetition, from the realization that American pilots continued to continue where survival itself was uncertain, and that they did so consistently. The air war over Europe revealed a transformation in modern warfare. Victory was no longer determined solely by speed, altitude, or technical superiority. It was shaped by systems that could absorb loss, manage human limits, and continue operating under conditions that punished every mistake. American pilots did not defeat the Luftwaffe by ignoring danger. They confronted it directly. Cold, hypoxia, mechanical failure, and exhaustion were shaded as expected costs rather than deterrents. Endurance became doctrine. Survival was negotiated minute by minute, mission by mission. German air doctrine built around efficiency and conservation of experienced pilots could not adapt quickly enough to this reality. The environment that once promised advantage became a shared burden, one that eroded capability unevenly. Where American systems replaced loss, German systems accumulated it. By the time this imbalance was fully understood, it could not be corrected. Altitude no longer offered safety. Cold no longer enforced limits. Human endurance itself had been weaponized. The legacy of this realization extends beyond the Second World War. It marked a shift toward conflicts decided not only by technology or tactics, but by an ability to sustain pressure where conditions offer no mercy. In the thin air above Europe where survival was never assured, the air war was decided quietly, by those who could remain present when others could not. And in that persistence, the outcome of the campaign was sealed long before the final bombs fell.